Thank you all for coming. This is a particularly important event because people in the West are not usually cognizant of the fact that women play an unheralded and unheard of role in the Arab world, a role that frequently leads them to positions of leadership, as we have seen during the course of the Arab Spring. Many women were in the leadership, they were in the front, they were in the field. They not only led the battles, they also suffered the consequences. But for these women, life in those societies is not easy. They have to struggle with a whole host of social prejudices and legal prejudices and difficulties that they have to encounter. And so it's so important for us tonight to hear from Mona Eltahawy, who has been at the forefront of what I can call a revolutionary movement among Arab and Muslim women to sort of reclaim the equality status that they justly deserve and which they have merited over time in those countries. These challenges are not easy, and Mona deals with them in terms of a revolution of both sexual, social, and I would add consequential legal norms. Yes, indeed, a revolution of the sort is needed in the Arab world. I'm sure you all join me in looking forward to hearing from her. She is an international journalist whose writings on women in the Middle East appeared in many media outlets in the world. In 2012, she wrote, "Why Do They Hate Us?" A controversial piece in foreign policy, and she has commented frequently in the media upon both her personal experience and the broader challenges facing women across the Middle East. Her new book, Headscarves and Hymens, is being very well received and is for sale this evening. After the presentation, Niamh will return to the stage to moderate the questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mona Eltahawy to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Us that a feminist like you comes to shake up our community. And that meant the world to me because, as I said, this is a very conservative town, and this came from a young man, probably in his early 20s. Now, I've spoken at TEDx events, in different parts of the world, but this was my first TEDx in Egypt, and it was my first in Arabic. So it was especially important for me as well, for many reasons. And the subject of my talk at Zaazit University was the need to start framing violence against women as a form of terrorism. Because my contention was, if one of the definitions of terrorism was violence that is meant to change one's behavior, then all the forms of violence against girls and women that I listed to them in the talk were surely forms of terrorism. And I began with, then I took it and I said, oh, so FGM is one of the earliest forms, and then domestic violence, whether it's from the father, the husband, or the brother, and then you take it out onto the street, and it's street sexual harassment, and then you take it out onto the state level, and then it becomes terrorism in the form of the forced virginity, so-called virginity tests that female revolutionaries were subjected to in Egypt in March of 2011 by military doctors, and also systematic forms of sexual violence that the Mubarak regime perpetrated against women journalists and protesters as early as 2005. So the sexual violence that we're seeing in the streets and during protests, when we could protest in Egypt, because we now live under a draconian protest law that will sentence you up to 15 years in prison, as some activists I know have been, if you do go out on a protest without the regime's permission. So I spoke about all those levels of violence, and the greater point, or the larger point behind all of that, was the point behind my book, which is that we began a political revolution, or political revolutions, when Tunisians took to the street in December of 2010. And those political revolutions were carried out with the understanding that the regime oppresses everybody, men and women. And you saw men and women against the regimes on the street, demanding dignity and freedom. And the chants that then you began to hear in Egypt when the revolution and uprisings began to spread were bread, liberty, social justice, and human dignity. Again, men and women recognizing that the regime oppresses everybody. So these were essentially political revolutions. They did not concern gender. Nobody was under any pretense that these were feminist revolutions or that they were revolutions for women's rights. None of that was happening. It was essentially uprisings against police brutality, against the idea that the Mubarak regime could just hand over power from father to son, and the reasons differed slightly as they spread from country to country. But what interested me most was what happened when those young women, or women generally, went home after they took part in those revolutions, after they risked their lives, because we lost women as we lost men during the revolutions. Many women were either shot dead, killed, beaten, or arrested, including myself. I had my arms broken and I was sexually assaulted by the Egyptian riot police. I was one of many women. This was not unique to me. But what happened when those women went home, having seen the power that they and their fellow countrymen had unleashed against the regime? So what I wanted to explore was, surely that revolution, when it goes home, becomes something different, because it has to confront those forms of terrorism that I mentioned in my talk at Zagzit University. The terrorism at home, or the violence at home, the violence on the street, and the violence from the state. So my contention again is, we began a political revolution because we recognized that the regime oppresses everybody. But as women, unless our revolution recognizes that the state, the street, and the home oppresses us as women specifically, that political revolution will fail. And the revolution that we need against the regime, the street, and the home is the social and the sexual revolution. And the way that it takes different forms became very clear to me when I traveled across the region last year to do a documentary for the BBC World Service Radio. And whether it was in countries that had revolutions like Tunisia or Libya and Egypt, or countries that didn't, such as Jordan, because I went to Jordan for this documentary as well with a producer called Gemma Newby, it was very obvious that women were taking that revolution home. When I first moved back to Cairo, because I moved back to Cairo 2 years ago, I was in the US from 2000 until 2013. And I went back to Egypt several times after the revolution began, including the time when I was assaulted in November of 2011. But I decided to move back for many reasons. One of them was to write this book, because it's too easy to write a book about feminism in New York. I mean, I lived, my life in New York was really easy. There is no challenge in living in New York and being a feminist. You can do it with your eyes closed. I taught for a while at the University of Oklahoma. Now, I joke, but only semi-joke, that Oklahoma is like the Middle East. I felt like I had gone back to the Middle East. Because, I was experiencing that kind of the conservatism, the religious conservatism, the patriarchy. And I would tell my students, many of whom were from women's and gender studies, that their feminism was frontline feminism for the US. And as I mentioned again and again, the misogyny that I cover or that I talk about in my book lies on a spectrum. There is no part of the world that has completely erased misogyny. Even the Nordic countries, God bless them, that always score the best on global gender indices, misogyny has not been erased anyway. We just lie on different points of that spectrum. And in Oklahoma, it was a big reminder to me, whether it was purity pledges and purity culture, which I can directly connect, and I do in my book, to what I call modesty culture in the Middle East and North Africa, or whether it was, the obvious erosion of reproductive rights by what I call the Christian Brotherhood of the United States. Now, I fight the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and I also fight the Christian Brotherhood in the United States. And it's become this saying of mine that I say to both of them, you're obsessed with my vagina, and I say, stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there. And that's, one of the main points in my book. And if you've watched any interviews I've given, I say this, it's become my mantra. Sometimes I introduce a few curse words in there, but I'm trying to keep it polite. Anyway, so, in Oklahoma, it was a real reminder that Christian conservatism, the Christian right wing, the Christian Brotherhood, was eroding reproductive rights here in the US. That's why I'm saying being a feminist in New York was easy. The feminist struggle in Oklahoma and the southern states is the frontline feminist struggle. So I decided to move back to Cairo to write this book because I wanted to be there. Obviously, I hadn't forgotten what it's like to be a feminist in Egypt. I became a feminist in Saudi Arabia at the age of 19, and I discussed that in the book. But I wanted to be in Egypt to see what it was like after those protests and what it was like for women who took the revolution home. And one of the first things I did was I formed a support group, because I'm an anarchist at heart, and I believe in consciousness raising and direct action groups. And if there's anything that I truly believe we need in Egypt is we need to revive those California women's consciousness raising groups that would bring women together in living rooms and give them a mirror and say, look up your legs, because your doctor shouldn't be the only person who sees what your genitals look like. Now this might seem flip, it might seem like flippant and a joke, but I'm serious. We don't have sex education in many countries of the Middle East and North Africa. Neither men nor women know how their bodies work when it comes to sex, and have very little knowledge or preparation for when they do want to start having sex, let alone when they want to have sex outside of marriage. So I started a small support group for consciousness raising. It includes only maybe 8 or 9 women, because I wanted to keep it small. But those 8 or 9 women who would come to the group once a week were a real reminder of what taking that revolution home meant. Because I would ask them, what happened to you after you went home? And many of them would say, I went home and I began to say no. Whether that no was in the form of removing a headscarf they no longer wanted to wear, whether that no was in the form of telling their parents, especially their mothers, I will travel alone, because they hadn't been allowed to travel alone because they had to be chaperoned in the past, or whether it was just to pluck up the courage to go out and join the protests. One 19-year-old woman who was a member of this support group told me, I was hearing all these horrible stories about what was happening to girls and women in the various protests, and I was too scared to go out. But me and my mother decided finally we would go out there, and once I got out there and I met other women, together we were able to encourage each other. And the importance of groups like that really hit home, especially when it comes to sharing knowledge. And this is where the social sexual revolution front lines basically are set by what I call sexual renegades and rebels, and people who dare to question and to ask. And during one of our group meetings, I introduced the subject of female genital mutilation. I don't lead the discussions. I like to just kind of sit back and facilitate. But I know that for many of the young women in the group, they don't have much experience with sex or relationships, but when they get stuck on something, they ask me because they know that I'm 47 years old, they know that I'm divorced, therefore, they know that I've had sex and I have experience. So I don't force this upon them, because that's not the point of the group, to basically shove my experience down their throat. But what I'm trying to do is to offer my experience for whenever they do want it. So it was in the run-up to February the 6th, which is the day of zero tolerance against female genital mutilation. And when I brought this subject up, several of the young women in the group said, oh my God, I can't believe that we still practice this in Egypt. Now in Egypt, female genital mutilation, many people are shocked to find out that between the ages of 15 to 49, 91% of Egyptian women have been genitally cut. 91%. Many people don't think this happens in Egypt. Many Egyptians refuse to believe these statistics. These are government statistics. Between the age of 15 to 19, it's 74%. So that's still 3/4 of our girls. NGOs in Egypt have been trying to fight female genital mutilation for the past 100 years, which says to me that it is so ingrained, and it is what I call the toxic mix of religion and culture. Now, genital cutting is practiced by both Muslims and Christians, but I know, because I know many Muslim families who continue to subject their daughters to this, that they do use religion to justify it. So we have to be honest about these things and really call them out. Anyway, these young women were saying, I can't believe that this still happens in Egypt. And I thought, well, that's great. That means at least they haven't been subjected to it. And one of the oldest women in the group, who's 35 years old, just out of the blue, she said, am I normal? And I said, what do you mean? And she said that when she was 8 years old, her family had moved to Saudi Arabia when she was a toddler. And her mother, who had been subjected to genital cutting, had determined that she would not do this to her daughter, which is how it begins. Now, mothers practice this not because they hate their daughters. On the contrary, they do this because they love their daughters and they want their daughters to be accepted by a society that demands this of them in order for the girls to be marriageable. So we can't go to mothers, the weakest link in this, and say, you must change this unless we change society holistically. Anyway, this young woman's mother had decided it would stop with her. But when she was 8 years old and her family was on summer vacation in Egypt, her grandfather took the opportunity of her mother being out shopping and called a midwife and had his granddaughter cut against her mother's wishes when she was 8. This is why I always remind people it's not about the mothers, it's the fathers and the grandfathers. We have to talk to the men. And this is where it requires a certain kind of sexual renegade and rebel in order to be able to stand up against an entire society that tells you if you want your daughter to be married, this is what you must subject her to, remembering the pain of your own genital cutting. Anyway, so this 35-year-old woman says to me, am I normal? When I have sex, am I going to be able to enjoy it? Now, this told me two things. She had been cut against her mother's wishes and she had not had sex at 35, which is very normal for the Middle East and North Africa. Virginity, as I mentioned, purity pledges in the South, virginity pledges that might not be signed in the Middle East and North Africa, but which are expected. You are expected, as I was for a very long time, to remain a virgin until you get married. So, I took a deep breath. I said to her, the clitoris is like an iceberg. Only 25% of it, if that, is above the surface, and the majority of nerve endings are below the surface. So I hope when the time comes for you to have sex, it will be with a partner who is patient and for whom your pleasure is important. Now, in that conversation, whether it was the young women saying, oh my God, I can't believe people still do this in Egypt, or the question from that 35-year-old woman, or my recognition that she had been cut against her mother's wishes and that she had not had sex at 35, that right there is the social and the sexual revolution that I talk about in my book, because that's what we need to unpack. Now, if I take it back to that talk at Zagazig University, after I spoke, I wasn't really sure how people were going to handle it, especially the men. But I had one young woman come up to me, and she was furious. She said to me, listen, I love everything you said, but what are we going to do to help these young women here in this provincial town that nobody in Cairo pays any attention to? What are we going to do to them when their families try to break them? When these young women try to break away from their family and do this social sexual revolution that you're talking about? So again, this taught me two things. In Cairo, most of the time, we forget that there are cities outside of Cairo. All the spotlight, all the attention goes to Cairo, the capital, where a host of our ills and the reasons that we need social and sexual revolutions exist. But Cairo, if anything, is probably head and shoulders above many of these other smaller cities, especially in the rural areas, especially in the very conservative provincial towns. But that this young woman who is a student at this university, in this provincial conservative town, is so full of rage and wants to know what are we going to do, fills me with hope. And that is the hope for the social sexual revolution that I'm talking about. And my answer to her was, I would gladly help you, but here's the thing, I cannot come here to Zagazig and say, hey, women of Zagazig, I'm going to start the revolution for you, because I can't be that presumptuous. I said to her, you must break down that door. Whatever door that is making you so angry, break it down and I will meet you on the other side. And again, that's the social and sexual revolution. It's recognizing each other and recognizing where we can meet and recognizing that as somebody from Cairo, I cannot go to Zagazig and expect them to be on the same page as I am and expect them to fully agree with everything I'm saying, but I must go there and provoke them and shake them up as much as I can, which is why I agreed to go, because this young man said to me, we need a feminist like you to come and shake us. The men and their reaction were also very interesting, because I had an engineering student who came up to me again, very upset, and he said to me, I don't know how to stop one of my best friends from sexually harassing women on the street. I see him and I want him to stop, and I know that it's wrong. Now, this is what we need to break the cycle of sexual harassment on Egypt, which affects almost 100% of girls and women. According to a UN survey that was carried out in Cairo, which again, I'm saying Cairo, the capital, so it's considered more progressive and a bit more liberal than other cities, 99.3% of women girls and women had experienced one form of street sexual harassment or another. And he said to me, and what upsets him the most is that when he watches boys as young as 9 and 10, watching these men, like his best friend, harassing girls, the message that these boys get is that this is what it means to be a man. And this also is part of our social sexual revolution, because if women took home this understanding that it's the state, the street, and the home that together oppress us, and we need a social sexual revolution against us, eventually the men must understand that that kind of oppression, that kind of patriarchy, and that kind of misogyny hurts them as well. In the same way that that man understood, that student understood, that it upsets him to see his friend do that. It upsets him to see boys and emulate men like that. We also have to get to the stage, and maybe this will be the subject of my next book, I don't know yet, of unpacking masculinity. What does masculinity mean in Egypt? Because I have so many young men who write to me and say, this is not the kind of man I want to be. Now, after I was sexually assaulted and had my arms broken by riot police, I appeared on several Egyptian TV shows and spoke in Arabic about what happened to me. 12 other women were sexually assaulted during the same protests that I was assaulted at, but none of them have been able to speak for various reasons, either because their families silenced them or they feel too ashamed to speak because it's still a very big taboo to speak about one's sexual assault. But because I was on TV and speaking in Arabic, obviously everybody knew what happened to me, and I had several Egyptian men who wrote to me and said the following: "Dear Sister Mona, I am so sorry for what happened to you, and I will not rest, and I apologize, and I bow down to you in shame for what happened, and I could not save you from what happened. And I promise you I will not rest until I restore your honor, or avenge your honor. Your brother so-and-so." Now, as much as I appreciated the sentiment that was behind this message, my reply was, "Dear brother so-and-so, you owe me no apology because it was not you who assaulted me. The men who assaulted me and the regime that trained the riot police to sexually assault women, they owe me an apology. And I remind you that my honor is intact. My honor does not need to be avenged or restored, but together, Egyptian women and men will restore Egypt's honor and dignity and take it away from this regime." So it's that conversation that is also part of the social and sexual revolution that will eventually lead to this understanding that, this phrase that we often hear, feminism is good for everybody. What does that really mean? Patriarchy hurts everybody. What does that really mean? As far as the Middle East and North Africa is concerned, when it comes to the social sexual revolution, it means young men questioning, am I that kind of man? Do I want to be that kind of man? It means families questioning things like what I discovered in Jordan, I mentioned earlier, that even in the countries that have not gone through uprisings and revolutions, I believe, and it's obvious, that just watching the uprisings and revolutions have inspired them into their own form of no and their own demanding of respect that these young women that I've met and have in my group and that I've interviewed across the region took home with them after the protests. Now in Jordan, one of the biggest problems and one of kind of like that lies at the heart of social and sexual revolution that I mention in my book, and that also affects issues of masculinity and what does it mean to be a man in these revolutionary times, and what impact are our countries continuing to have during these revolutionary times, is a law that allows rapists to escape prosecution if they agree to marry their victim. Now, I cannot imagine a worst case scenario than this. Now, in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa, those kind of laws were put into their penal codes by colonial powers. Morocco, for example, had a law that allowed a rapist to escape prosecution and conviction if he agreed to marry his victim. France put it into the Moroccan law. But France has long since repealed that law, but it took 2 suicides of 2 young women in Morocco, one 16 and one 12, who were forced to marry their rapists. After those suicides, hundreds and hundreds of Moroccan women and men were on the streets demanding an end to that law, and it was repealed. But unfortunately, families continue to force their daughters to marry their rapists because of these ideas of honor and shame, and until we put sexual assault and sexual violence and rape fully on the table and point the fingers where they deserve to be pointed and say that these girls are not what their families think, quote-unquote, damaged property that nobody will agree to marry, and so therefore they force them to marry their rapists, there is no revolution. So I'm going to wrap up now because I would much rather have a Q&A with you all rather than me just standing up here and talking forever. But the social and the sexual revolution is essentially a recognition that these are revolutionary times. And the concept of feminism is not a Western import that I need to take to my part of the world, because the modern feminist movement in the Middle East and North Africa was launched as far back as the 1920s when an Egyptian feminist called Hoda Sha'rawi very publicly unveiled. In the 1950s, we had another Egyptian feminist who had an organization called Bint al-Nil, Daughter of the Nile, who, along with 1,500 Egyptian women, stormed the Egyptian parliament in 1954, I believe it was, to demand that Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had promised women political rights, give women the right to vote. 2 years later, Egyptian women eventually got the right to vote. So this was in the 1950s. And there are other Egyptian and non-Egyptian feminists like Nawal Saadawi, Fatima Mernissi from Morocco, and for more contemporary examples that I mention in my book, Saudi Arabia, a country that you don't normally associate with feminism, but where I became a feminist thanks to feminist books and journals in the library of King Abdulaziz University, where I spent my freshman and sophomore years. Some renegade professor had put these journals up on the bookshelves and saved my mind, essentially. But there are feminists there like Wajiha Al-Huwaidar, who was filming herself breaking the ban on driving back in 2008. Manal al-Sharif, who went to jail for 10 days because she also filmed herself driving. And every year there is a campaign to break the ban on women's driving in Saudi Arabia. That ban on women's driving, that law that allows rapists to escape prosecution if they marry their victim, female genital mutilation, domestic violence, street sexual harassment, all of those, by way of wrapping up, are basically essentially issues of agency and consent. And it is ultimately my contention that the revolution, the social sexual revolution, without which our political revolution will fail, are revolutions of consent and agency. Because if we go out on the street and we demand freedom and dignity, at the heart of freedom and dignity is agency and consent, and that agency and consent for half of society must be paramount. Otherwise, these are not revolutions I want to belong to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for questions. If you wouldn't mind, please, raising your arm and waiting for a mic. Yeah, we'll start right here in the second row, please. Maria.
Thank you for sharing your experience. You spoke about the responsibility of both women and men in the Middle East.
Sorry, just 1 second. Your mic needs to be turned up. Excuse me. I think it's turned on. It just needs to be turned up. You can try it again now, please. No, the guy in the back's turning it up, sorry. Go ahead, say it again, please.
You spoke about the responsibility of both women and men in the Middle East for the sexual revolution in the Middle East. I'm wondering what women, what men in America might do to support the revolution. And actually, as I was forming that question in my mind, I was also thinking about what you refer to as the Christian Brotherhood in Oklahoma, and I don't even know exactly how I would approach that without being presumptuous. So I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. You know, I mentioned in my book about how difficult it can be for me or anyone who speaks about the issues of my own cultural and faith backgrounds to an audience that is not from the Middle East and North Africa, because it's like walking into a minefield. And the last thing that I want to do, and this is something that I also fought very hard against when I was teaching at Oklahoma University, the last thing I want to do is for anybody here or any other audience to think, oh my God, it's so bad over there, and everything has been fixed over here. So often when I'm asked, what can I do to help you or to help women from where you come from, my answer is to help women of your community. Even if it's not the women of Oklahoma, because the women of Oklahoma, believe me, are on the front lines, just as the women in Texas were on the front lines for Wendy Davis and, you know, the women in Alabama. I know reproductive rights activists in all of those states, and I know that they're constantly on the front line, whether they're doing clinic escort activism, or they're out there fighting things like the Personhood Bill, or they're fighting Rick Perry or other members of the Christian Brotherhood of the United States. So the best thing I believe that you can do is to help your community. And I say that because one of the things I try to do with my book is to connect my issues, the issues of my own culture and faith background, to global feminism. Because as I said, misogyny lies on a spectrum. And I honestly believe that we are right now going through a global feminist moment. China, after International Women's Day, arrested several feminist activists, and 5 of them are still in jail, just for daring to march and protest against domestic violence and other forms of violence against women in China. A few weeks ago, we saw women in Kabul, Afghanistan, who dared to violate kind of traditional Islamic practices in funerals when they insisted on burying a woman called Farkhunda who had been lynched. In Turkey, we saw something very similar about 2 or 3 months ago, when a woman who had been raped and murdered, the women in her town in Turkey again insisted that they would bury her, even though, according to most Muslim burial practices, women can only take part in some parts of the funeral services, and then the men take over. So when I connect all of these, and then here in the US, you know, the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, that was started by black women. And it was started by black women in the recognition that black women are in a position that I often like to say inspires me, because the way I see black feminism, from, you know, as far back as people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, who I quote at length in my book, When I look at black women's feminism in the United States, it's a feminism that is based on the recognition that you are fighting that double fight, and that is a fight against racism and a fight against sexism. And that sexism or misogyny is from within and from without. So, I urge you from whatever community you're from, if you're here from Chicago, to find any way that you can help feminism here, because when we engage in feminist struggle anywhere, I honestly believe that we lift feminism everywhere. And when somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood, where I come from, sees what I call the Christian Brotherhood do here to feminism, they point to the US and you say, you see, even in the US, they don't care about women's rights. Why are you concerned about feminism? That's why I say, help the women of your community, because the more we lift each other up, the more none of the men who are misogynists can use our examples against us.
Thank you. Next question, the gentleman, please, in the third row.
Thank you, Wafa, for that nice talk. My name is Naveen Musharraf. I am originally from Pakistan. But my comment is, the sexual revolution you are talking about cannot take place in isolation unless and until there is a revolution and change and renaissance within Islam, which is high time. And Islam is a backward and violent religion. Unless that changes, there are the Sharia laws which are discriminatory against Muslims, against women. Unless that changes, the inheritance laws or the second-class status that women have, or the polygamy. Unless and until this changes, you can't have sexual revolution. That's one question. Second question is,
Sir,
we
have lots of questions, so if you could just
okay.
speed
Do
it
you
up,
have
thanks.
contact with other feminist women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Wafa Sultan who are fighting for the same cause?
Right, I'll answer
Thank
your
you.
first question first. I talk about Islamic law and interpretations of Islamic law and how it's often used against women and to discriminate against women in my book. But I belong to a movement called Musawa, which is the Arabic word for equality. And it's a movement that was launched in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in 2009 that brings together scholars and activists. And it brings together scholars and activists who identify, those who identify as Islamic feminists and those who identify, as I do, just as secular feminists. So I'm a Muslim and a feminist. I don't call myself a Muslim feminist. And the wonderful thing about Musawa is that Musawa is a movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. So what it does is it looks at UN declarations and various conventions that countries have signed, it looks at constitutions, it looks at the laws of various countries, but more importantly for me, and I'm guessing what you're talking about, the impact of things like polygamy and the inheritance laws and the misogyny that is too often used by scholars and clerics in the name of Islam to oppress women, and what they call lived realities. So they look at what it's like to really live in a polygamous family. They look at what it's really like to have to see your brother get double your inheritance, all of that. And they try to fight those discriminations and misogynies within the framework of a movement, basically, for Muslims and feminists. Now, the reason I do not work with women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Wafa Sultan is because they have left Islam, and it's totally, absolutely their right to leave Islam. I have not. I am working with women who have remained in Islam and women who believe that they can change the way and fight the way that clerics and scholars and governments and societies generally use Islamic interpretation against women. And one of those scholars that is a personal mentor of mine who does identify as an Islamic feminist is the African-American scholar of Islam, Amina Wadud. Now, exactly 10 years ago, in March of 2005, Amina Wadud led us in the first public mixed gender Friday prayer. She was the imam, she gave the khutbah, the sermon, and I prayed side by side with men, I prayed without a headscarf, and I prayed on my period. And all of those things are considered very controversial. But all of those things are exactly what I'm talking about. People who push the lines, the sexual renegades, the scholars who are out there giving us the space. So the point I'm making here is that I work with women like Amina Wadud and movements like Musawa because we need to create the space within Islam and to reclaim it and to take it back. And when I'm asked, why have you chosen to remain a Muslim? I say because we must work in that space and push that space and make it bigger. But I also say that one of the things that I'm trying to do is revive the spirit of Khadija. Now, Khadija was Muhammad's first wife. She was 15 years older than him. She proposed to him and she employed him. She was his only wife until she died. Now, if the man who we believe was the Prophet of Islam was married to a woman 15 years older than him, and she was his only wife until she died, that says something to me about both Muhammad and Khadija that we have lost in Islam. Today, our clerics, sadly, say nothing about child marriage, and they justify it, claiming that Muhammad was married to a child when he married Aisha. I say it's 2015 and I don't care how old she is, and I remind them of how old Khadija was, because she was 15 years older than him. Now, if we can get our clerics and scholars to encourage young unemployed men in the Middle East and North Africa to marry women who are 15 years older than them in the prophetic tradition and say that this is sunnah, this is why I remain in Islam, because those are the lines that we have to push.
Thank you. Yeah, the young lady, please, in the back row, second to last row.
Yes, hi. You talked about how a lot about sexuality and the functionality of sex, and mentioned that parents are not teaching their children about sex. I was wondering if you can discuss if they're teaching them about love or relationships, or are they just getting this from TV, or is it non-existent in the culture?
Right, right. You know, one of the anecdotes that I mentioned in my book was something that my dad shared with me when I was writing the book. He and my mother were watching a TV show where a cleric, a famous cleric, was taking questions from a Q&A, calling Q&As. And this woman called in and she said, you know, I've been married to my husband for X number of years. I really love him, but he beats me. And, you know, I don't know what to do. And the cleric actually said to her, if you sit down and add the pros and the cons, you will see that I'm sure the pros are much more than the cons. And let me ask you a question. What do you do that makes your husband beat you? Now, my dad was furious. My parents were furious, and they turned the channel. And my dad shared this anecdote with me, and he said to me, I couldn't believe this, that I had once respected this man. I've lost all respect for him, because what he should have asked instead was, why does he beat you? Put him on the phone and let me ask him why he beats you, not what do you do to beat him. So that's by way of answering your question, in that, unfortunately, a lot of mainstream media in the Middle East and North Africa, in the form of films and TV shows, which are very popular, we're constantly seeing violence, women being subjected to violence, just kind of like casual slaps, casual insults that have become just like the air we breathe, that we take for granted. So no, they're not teaching them enough. And you know, people in the Middle East and North Africa are under tremendous pressures, whether it's poverty, whether it's the fundamentalisms of various kinds they're fighting, whether it's regime terror and other forms of terror, many, many pressures. But unless we take that fight back, unless we are the sexual renegades, as I mentioned, and one of the points that I meant to add to my own talk, and something that I began to do in my own talks, and I recently did it at a conference for Muslim women, and it's very important for me to do it at a conference for Muslim women. I was invited to speak to a conference of Muslim women from around the world that was held in Oslo, probably because we could never hold a conference like this anywhere else, was to talk about the importance and the right of women to sexual pleasure. So the whole point of my talk was, okay, we began to talk about sexual violence now, and to push beyond the taboos that have silenced us in talking about our own assaults and how we've survived, etc., etc. But we can't stop there, because if we stop there, then sex is continually associated with violence. And so what we must now do, being those sexual renegades and the kind of the vanguard of the sexual and social revolution, is to start talking about women's pleasure and their right to desire and pleasure. And one of the things that makes me the saddest is that we have forgotten that this is part of our heritage, because there's a great book called Classical Poems of Arab Women. And these are poems of Arab women from the 10th and 11th century. And if you read those poems, they are risque. It's like women basically sending out booty calls. Come and thrust me twice, and I don't know what, and my bosom this, and my genitals that. This is from the 10th century in Arabic, and we have lost that. And so one of the things that I try to do in my talks and in my writing is to remind people, because we're so caught up in the conservatism, the pendulum has swung so far to the right, because not just because of the Islamists, but because our own regimes have tried to outdo the Islamists in conservatism. I'm trying to remind people that it is part of our heritage in the Middle East and North Africa to have these incredibly courageous women write poems in which they say, I demand pleasure, it is my right to have desire. So I think this is something that has to start now, and I honestly believe that the young people in the region today, I give examples in my book of a Moroccan human rights defender. She was head of the Moroccan human rights organization. Her name is Khadija Riyadi. She launched a campaign in Morocco to decriminalize sex outside of marriage. And there's also an anecdote that I give of Tunisian teenagers who were taken to court because they posted pictures of themselves kissing on Facebook. And as a form of protesting their trial, Tunisians went out on the street and had a kiss-in, where they had lots of couples kissing and posting pictures on Facebook. So you see these things happening, you know, bits and pieces here and there, but again, it is born out of the idea that these are revolutionary times when we should be pushing the lines as far as we can.
Thanks. There was another young woman in the row, please, in the back, please.
Hi. So, in the people that you've encountered who are sexually progressive, like in Egypt or other places, not just the men, but also the women, have you noticed a demographic outside of their gender that unifies them? I guess what I'm asking is, are they of a certain social stature or educational background? And if they don't have that in common, what do you think it is that has brought them to their progressiveness?
I think it's the recognition that for so long they have obeyed and conformed to something that was essentially harming them. And then the revolution came about and they looked around and said, what the hell with this, you know? And there's one young woman that comes to mind in particular, and I mention her in my book. She's a 24-year-old lawyer who works at a center for women and girls in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Cairo. Very working class neighborhood that doesn't even have a police precinct, and in which myself and the producer who made this documentary for the BBC World Service Radio had to be escorted in because it's so small and so conservative that if outsiders come in, you know, they might just be approached and taken out because people don't trust them. So this young woman, her name was Nesma Al-Khatib. And she told me, she said, you know, I have been fighting since I was 14 years old. She was subjected to genital cutting, but she was so enraged by what happened to her. When her sisters began to have daughters, she told each one of them, and I quote, she said, I told my family that if you don't stop this, and if you subject my nieces to this, I'm going to turn this house upside down. Some of her sisters wear the niqab, the face veil. She wears a headscarf. She said her sisters were pushing her and forcing her to wear the niqab, but she refused. And then she went to law school against her family's wishes. And then she decided to work in women's rights against her family's wishes. At one point, her family kicked her out of the house, but she continued. And then she said, you know, the revolution started. And then I realized that I wasn't the only one doing this. And I went out on the street, and it wasn't just a matter now of just saying to my family, no, it was, I demand that you do this. I demand that you do that. Now, she's not, you know, an upper-class Cairene woman. I'm not really interested in upper-class Cairene women because their privilege and their wealth often protects them. That privilege is often a buffer against a lot of the things that I write about. It's women like Nesma, who is fighting for women and girls in this social center in a working class neighborhood. It's women like the students that I met at Zagazig University. And why are they progressive? Because they realized that conforming and obeying was harming them. And I honestly believe that each and every single one of us is born with the innate desire to be free. And then we grow up and we see what we're taught and we see how we're socialized. And at some point in our life, we have to sit there and think, this is so wrong. You know, and I reached that point when I was 19 and I discovered these feminist journals in Saudi, because I often say, to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, you have one of two choices. You either lose your mind or you become a feminist. At first, I lost my mind because I fell into a deep depression, and then I became a feminist. So I think it's that moment when you realize, I deserve to be free.
Next question. Yes, please. The woman right here in the three seats in.
Well, Mona, thank you. I just want to say, as a woman, as a feminist, as a Muslim, thank you for bringing this cause up front. I grew up in the Middle East as well and totally understand and can connect to a lot of these experiences you've talked about. Where I'm optimistic is sort of seeing this shift in private and public realm, like women are saying no. You see a shift in media where media is not shaming women anymore, and you see more and more men speaking up for women's rights. Where I'm a little nervous is this general sprawling of fundamentalism, this Wahhabi ideology, Salafist movement, and it's sprawling again throughout Muslim communities. Yeah. So I guess what I'm missing, I wanted to know from you is, what should we do? What is the sexual revolution for us? Mm-hmm. What steps should we take to fight against this fundamentalism at the state level?
Right. Well, you know, again, I think, you know, for you as an American Muslim or as a Muslim here in the US, it's vital that you fight this kind of conservatism right here. Because, you know, when I first moved to the US in 2000, I found a lot of the conservatism among Muslim communities here was inspired and fueled by this idea that the real Islam, quote unquote, was back there. Wherever back there happened to be in, from whatever background we're from. So it was back there from Al-Azhar, or it was back there from Iran, or back there from Pakistan, regardless, you know, or depending on where you come from. And it, you know, it's obviously a myth. You know, I spent many years of my life as an immigrant or as an expat, and I saw what my own parents were doing when we lived in London, where they romanticize, you know, where we came from. Oh, in Egypt we never do this, you know. In Egypt we practice proper Islam. In Egypt we do this. And it's a myth. It's this romantic notion of what it's like back there. So I think that's what allows a lot of conservatives to really make inroads into especially our young people, that over there is the true Islam. No, over here is the true Islam. There is no one true Islam. And Islam is what you make it. So when you encounter that kind of conservatism in your own community here, fight it. Because as I said, anytime you don't fight it and anytime it gets stronger here, the conservatives that we're fighting back there, whether they're conservatives of the regime or conservatives of the Muslim Brotherhood or of the Salafi and Wahhabi movements sponsored and supported by the Saudis, all of them are happy because they say, you see, even in America, they like this kind of conservatism. So why are you claiming you want to be free of it? So fight it here. And, you know, there are so many. Since I moved to the US in 2000, and it was after 9/11 actually, because of the horror and the shock of 9/11 to the Muslim community. In 2004, I was a member of what is now defunct, a movement called the Progressive Muslim Union of North America. It was disbanded after about a year. But many of those founding members that were on the board of directors with me have formed other progressive groups. So now, you know, I encourage you to look up Muslims for Progressive Values. That was co-founded by a dear friend of mine who was on the board of directors of PMU with me, called Ani. And Ani is a Malaysian-born, she's of Malaysian descent. She's a singer-songwriter who lives in LA. And what Ani has done with Muslims for Progressive Values is just fantastic. And one of the things that excites me the most about what they have done, and because I also talk about LGBT issues in the Middle East and North Africa in my book, not enough because that needs another book, you know, all of its own, is that MPV has promoted two really important ideas for the social and sexual revolution, and that is feminism and women's rights, or gender equality generally, and LGBT rights. And the two are intimately connected because it's essentially rising up against patriarchy. And another mentor of mine and a good friend and a hero of mine is an openly gay imam called Imam Dai Abdallah. He is from DC. He has put together a mosque in DC that is welcoming of everybody, the LGBT community, feminists, everyone. And Imam Dai often travels to various parts of the world, including European countries where Muslims live as minorities, where they have to fight against his conservative ideas, to talk about being an openly gay imam. Because for most people, the idea is inconceivable. You know, watch a film like A Jihad for Love, which was made by an openly gay Indian Muslim director, where he travels across the world and goes to Muslim-majority countries and speaks to people who are lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, and an openly gay imam in South Africa about what it's like to be Muslim and gay, or Muslim and queer, and how it has to be possible to be both so that we don't force people in our community to have to choose between the two. So these are all things that we can do in whatever community we live in. So here, you know, find your local chapter of Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm sure they have a chapter here in Chicago, and see what you can do with them. I'm sure there's a lot.
Next question. Yeah, right over here on the end, please. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is adding a slightly different dimension to the gentleman from Pakistan's question. And it's the end result of most of these formal and informal revolutionary networks in the Middle East. You see some of the end result is the development of secular legal institutions. Is the answer perhaps the development of secular legal institutions, or a completely secular society that can enshrine the strategy and the values of these formal and informal revolutionary networks?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, for me, it would be. And that's why I said I don't identify as an Islamic feminist. I'm a Muslim and a feminist, but the two are separate because I do identify as a secular feminist. And that kind of secular feminism has been most prominent in various countries of North Africa. When I went to Tunisia, I met many feminists who for a long time have fought for their feminism along secular lines. So yes, for me, I would love to see the development of a much more secular society, because I believe that religion does belong in a private realm at home and does not interfere in politics of any kind, because I think this is one of our biggest struggles is that it is to separate the two, because as I said, many of our regimes end up trying to outdo the conservatives in religiosity, because a lot of the times those conservatives accuse them of being not Muslim enough, of being, puppets of the West, etc., etc. But having said that, at the same time, I also recognize that there are people in the region who do not follow a secular ideology. And again, I met several of them in Tunisia, including a woman from Ennahda. Now, Ennahda, as you know, is their kind of, people often call Ennahda in Tunisia's Muslim Brotherhood, and I dispute that totally, because the Ennahda in Tunisia is so much more progressive than the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is, much more. And one of the women I met was one of the women who was voted into Tunisia's Constituent Assembly that formulated their constitution. Now, not all the women from Ennahda agreed with the particular passage in Tunisia's recently passed constitution that guaranteed gender equality. But the woman that I interviewed for the BBC documentary I made did. Her name was Fatma Al-Aswad. Now, she told me of her own history under the Ben Ali regime of going to law school and having to wear a beret because she wasn't allowed to wear a headscarf because that Ben Ali regime banned headscarves from, government buildings and universities and stuff. Now, obviously, we don't share a lot. Our ideologies are very, very different, because I am secular and she openly identifies with political Islam. But she told me something that was really interesting. She said the reason that she joined her secular Constituent Assembly members in fighting for this particular passage in the Constitution to guarantee equality between men and women was, she said, when women fight, only men benefit. And I think that's an important recognition, as we're trying to push, especially for women's rights. Because she said to me, you need to go back to Egypt and tell seculars like yourself that, look, we can also fight for feminism in Tunisia. And I said to her, you need to come with me to Egypt to show the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood women that they can be feminists, because so far they've just been foot soldiers of the patriarchy. Because a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood women were saying things like, it's undignified for women to protest, brothers and fathers should do it for them, until Morsi was overthrown, and then the Muslim Brotherhood put them on the front line. And then these same Muslim Brotherhood women would say, polygamy is a man's right. I oppose polygamy and I want to see polygamy banned everywhere. And these same women, they were basically saying everything that upheld man's primacy, which obviously is antithetical to the revolution I'm calling for. So it's a tough struggle, and it's a struggle that ultimately we must resolve in the understanding that when women fight, only men benefit.
Next question. Yes, please, right over here.
Okay, so I was wondering, because these sexist values are so ingrained in men and women too, and these people are everywhere. They're in government, they're in religious houses, and I'm just wondering, what can we do? What can we do to get the women to realize how powerful they are and what they can do, and to get to men to realize what they're doing is wrong?
Okay. The simple answer is destroy patriarchy. How we destroy patriarchy is going to take me 10 more books. But no, look, this movement, Musawa, that I mentioned, that I belong to, one of the things that they do that I think is incredibly powerful and effective is they have workshops for activists in various countries where they bring together activists, whether they're secular, whether they identify as Islamic feminists, whatever it is, and they basically give them the ammunition, the intellectual ammunition, to go out into their various communities on the ground, grassroots level, to challenge the idea that genital cutting is an Islamic practice, that polygamy is good for women, that child marriage is something that we must never ever fight against. So what I'm saying is we need a combination of the secular strategies of these activists, along with the intellectual ammunition that is given to them by scholars like Amina Wadud and others that I mentioned, so that when they do encounter the religious types, whether they're from the mosque or whether it's at home where the father or the mother says, you're challenging the ideas of our religion, this is haram, it's a sin, they're able to counter back with religion. So I think we need to be inventive, we need to be creative, and we need to arm ourselves in whatever ways we can. For me, the way that I continue to try to fight it, is through this consciousness raising group. So I always encourage people, in whatever small way they can, bring people together, raise their consciousness, discuss these issues with them, because these 9 or 10 women that would get together with me once a week, they would often say, when my colleagues at work find out that I come here once a week, the men are so scared. They're like, what are you doing in these groups? You're just getting together and just like hexing men, right? So, just the idea that 9 or 10 women are getting together once a week to talk and to just share their experience, whether it's to vent frustration because they were just sexually harassed on the street, or to discuss a relationship that failed. Shall I unfollow him on Facebook? Every time I see him on Twitter, it upsets me. You know, whatever it is. So from kind of the minutiae of their daily lives to the bigger struggles of being safe in a public space that is increasingly male, just the idea that 9 or 10 women are getting together to talk about this terrifies men. So do whatever you can to terrify the patriarchy. That's my solution.
Mona, there's been a lot of talk lately about Muslim integration in Europe, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the feminist experience of that and how it is in continental Europe and the UK, since you have some experience of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most exciting developments for me in the UK especially, but is also spreading across various countries on the continent, is the growing realization that there is a group of Muslim feminists who are able to speak for Muslim women, and that every time, because for the longest time, the media, whenever something came up, would go to the community leaders. And the community leaders were often very, very conservative men who claimed to speak on behalf of the whole community and often didn't care about women or women's rights and were often very misogynist. It took a long time, for example, for these feminist groups in the UK to get British law to recognize that so-called honor killings should be considered murder and not something that should be given cultural license. And men who carried out these so-called honor crimes or so-called honor killings got reduced sentences. Now I'm seeing these kind of efforts in Sweden, in Norway, in the UK, where again, more and more women who were born and raised in Europe or have moved to Europe and are taking up the feminist cause are saying, come to us and talk to us directly and stop going to the men to speak on our behalf. And I think this is an incredibly exciting development because for too long the conversation has happened above our head. And one of the most worrying developments for me as well is that you get this conflict between a very racist and Islamophobic and xenophobic right wing, which just wants to point out just how quote unquote barbaric Muslims and especially Muslim men are. And then you get a left wing that are in order to protect us from that racism and xenophobia are incredibly culturally relativistic. And they think that this is the best way to fight the racism. But all that ends up doing is creating a culture of racism of low expectations. Because they're basically saying it's their culture, leave them alone. And we're saying, no, it's not. We actually do not like to be beaten in the name of so-called culture. So I think that the rise of these newer and much more vocal feminist groups in various countries in Europe, I think will not just help Muslim women, but will also help this weak point of racism that a lot on the right wing, whether it's Front National in France or the Danish People's Party in Denmark or UKIP in the UK and the British National Party, I think women are not just key to the social sexual revolution, but are key also to fixing this racism problem that looks down upon us at the same time as trying to save us.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, the young woman there in the second row, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm a human rights lawyer.
Is that you? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that's me. From Saudi Arabia. And growing up in Saudi Arabia, we are always, as women, taught that we are not good enough just because of our gender. And unfortunately, the issue in Saudi Arabia, it's not only a cultural issue, it's not only a religious issue, it's a legal issue. It's legal to control women based on these guardianship system in Saudi Arabia. And oftentimes, I find it difficult to help those women because, well, what can you do? I cannot break the law, especially being a lawyer. So in your opinion, how can we work around those barriers? Thank you.
Thank you for your question and thank you for sharing your experience. I mean, as I said, I became a feminist in Saudi, so full solidarity. I think it's really important to speak about the various women that I mentioned, whether it's Wajia al-Hawaydar or Manar al-Sharif, or the women who as far back as 1990 were breaking the law by getting into their cars and carrying out one of the earliest known examples of a driving protest in Saudi Arabia, very soon after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I think it will have to take groups of women, perhaps not yourself and lawyers, but other women who are not lawyers, to break the law. I'm a big fan of civil disobedience. I'm a big fan, especially of non-violent civil disobedience. Having lived several years in this country and having been arrested myself in 2012 after I spray painted over a racist and bigoted ad in the New York subway, I'm a big advocate of civil disobedience because I think sometimes the law is unjust and sometimes the law must be broken and violated in order to highlight how unjust it is. And in the US, we have a long history of that, whether it's the civil rights movement using civil disobedience or feminism or the anti-Vietnam War movement. So I think it will take a concerted effort by Saudi women to break the law. Because I think what the reason that Saudi Arabia gets away with it on every level, including the legal, and how it gets away with treating women like children, essentially for their entire lives, through this guardianship system, is that Saudi Arabia, and I discuss this in my book, Saudi Arabia has somehow persuaded the world that it's exceptional. And this exceptionalism is just rubbish. It's not exceptional, it's exceptionally misogynistic, but that's about it. But the reason it gets away with it, I mean, as you know, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, because it's home to the two holiest places in Islam, and so the Muslim world is just like, ooh, we can't criticize Saudi Arabia. It spends billions of dollars on buying arms and weapons from its Western allies, so it keeps the arms industry very happily wealthy, and it has oil. And so those three things have given Saudi Arabia cachet that very few people, now remember when the Swedish foreign minister wanted to challenge Saudi Arabia and both its misogyny and the flogging of Raif Badawi at the Arab League, the Saudis prevented her from speaking at the Arab League. And here was this woman, Margot Wallenstorm, I think her name is, trying to finally enact a so-called feminist foreign policy. The business community in Sweden turned against her because they wanted Saudi money. So this is just to rubbish any idea that any of us, whether it's you as a Saudi woman or me as an Egyptian woman, is waiting for the outside world to rescue us, because they're not, because they sold us out a long time ago because of weapons and because of oil and because of the custodian of the two holy mosques. We are going to rescue ourselves. And I honestly believe in Saudi Arabia, the revolution will come because it will be women who will break the law, concerted civil disobedience that will show the lie that the Saudi regime makes about society is not ready. It's not society that's not ready. It's the regime that's not ready. Because every year when Saudi women, thank you. Every year when Saudi women get into their cars, they have their brothers and their fathers often in the passenger seat filming them, and people in the street seeing them, and who panics and freaks out? It's not the people around them, it's the police. So, concerted civil disobedience. I think that's the way.
We have time for one more quick question. Yeah, this woman right here in the middle, please. Right there in the middle, see with her arm up?
What types of systems and programs do you think need to be in place to help support these women that are speaking out that may face backlash, particularly from friends, families, and their support systems, particularly if they're not economically independent?
Yes. Well, again, these systems must be something that is set up inside, because I resist any kind of, how can I help you from the outside, as I said many times, because I think that's only counterproductive. I mean, it's productive, and this is the instance where I do say you generally can help us is, for example, John Kerry was in Saudi Arabia very soon after one of the major Saudi protests, driving protests, where women got into a car and very courageously broke the law in a form of civil disobedience that I mentioned. And when John Kerry was asked about it, he very cowardly, in my opinion, said, "It is not our business, this is Saudi culture, we don't interfere in other people's culture." Can you imagine if a foreign minister had gone to South Africa and had been asked about apartheid and said it's none of our business? Saudi Arabia practices gender apartheid, and yet the outside world is silent, shamefully silent. So the outside world must recognize that when the various Western allies go to Saudi Arabia and talk to the Saudis, they should start saying things like, stop practicing gender apartheid. They should do what the Swedish foreign minister tried to do. Enough of them do that, and their business communities will not hold them hostage in the way that the Swedish foreign minister was. Now, internally is where my focus is. I get so many messages. Just before I came to Egypt, I got 2 messages in 1 week. One message from a woman saying, "I know a 9-year-old girl who is about to be genitally cut because her father wants her to and her mother doesn't. How can we help her?" And I got another message saying there is a woman, this was in Cairo, there is a woman in Port Said who wants to take her headscarf off and wants to leave home, but her family won't let her, and we're trying to find her a job in Cairo. What can we do? Right now, there's very little I can do. What I would love to do, Harriet Tubman had an underground railroad for freeing slaves, right? We need an underground railroad for freeing women in the Middle East. Harriet Tubman very famously said, "I freed 1,000 slaves, I would have freed many more if they had known they were slaves." This is the thing, the recognition that we are slaves to a gender apartheid that does not care about us, where we end up starting up some kind of system where if someone needs to escape for whatever reason, I have a spare room in my apartment, come stay with me. I know someone who can give you an internship. I know a doctor who can get you out of this clinic, whatever it is. And eventually that's what's going to happen, where we realize that we only have ourselves to turn to, and we rescue ourselves, because that is the only way to be free, to rescue ourselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Mona for her talk. She'll be signing her book over here to the right.